All right, now people are popping up.
Yeah, but I gave Noel. Hey, Noel, can you make sure you're muted for me?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure it out.
Okay, cool.
I have dog hair all over my keyboard.
What is it? Maybe if I just turn it down, will that work?
I think that should be, yeah. I could just hear Carrie in the back.
Okay, why is this not working? Oh, there we go. I'm just blind. No, wait. I'm so sorry.
You're good.
Hey,
Everybody. All right, we got a few people signed in here and I think we'll go ahead and start. Welcome everybody to the community table. And our session today is on service and emotional support animals. Our presenter is Kat Hartledge from Kentucky Fair Housing Council. We're excited to have her talk to us today because this is a topic that we can't seem to get enough of around here. And I'll say that if you have questions or comments, just use the chat or raise your hand. I'm going to help monitor that and I can unmute you if needed so that you can talk. I'm not going to waste anybody's time. I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Kat.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I've got a presentation ready for you guys today. I will say, I think it is easiest if you all just ask as many questions as you have. I've got a lot of information for us ready to go, but you know what's going on with your clients, with your folks, and exactly what you need information on. So please just feel free, really I'll be looking at the chat too, and to raise your hand to come off mute, because I'd much rather this be a discussion that you all lead, and I'm just the person with the information, that can kind of guide you, to some answers. But I don't know what those questions and what's going on in the community is until you tell me. So with that, we're gonna go over some basics of fair housing, just because it's easier if we all have a basic idea of what housing discrimination looks like and what the fair housing law looks like in order to be able to utilize it. And of course, what my organization does and how you can utilize us. A little bit about Louisville's protected classes, just in case you guys have any questions. And then we're going to talk about disability and emotional support animals and accommodation requests and how you can navigate those best for clients and folks you serve in the community. So all of that together, and then of course a good amount of time for questions at the end. So please let me know if you need anything along the way to be able to understand if there is a topic that we don't get to today, because right, we're only talking about disability and emotional support animals. So if you're like, I actually really need more information about the source of income or race-based discrimination or harassment or whatever it may be, then make sure to get my information at the end and we can talk about reaching out and having me come talk a little bit more about that topic. Yeah. So I work for the Kentucky Fair Housing Council. We are a nonprofit civil rights agency here in the state of Kentucky, and we work for to eradicate housing discrimination. We do that through the enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, and any local or state laws that are applicable as well through it. And we are the only private nonprofit agency. So anybody else you report to is going to be a government agency, and we investigate complaints throughout the state. We are located in Lexington. I'm actually in Louisville, so if you need me to come by your agency here in Louisville, I'm happy to do so. But our office is physically located in Lexington. We investigate claims of housing discrimination. So should someone face housing discrimination in any form, should someone have their request for an emotional support animal get unfairly denied, then we would investigate that claim for them when they call us. We have a great intake staff that looks into those cases and gathers that evidence on their behalf. And then should they need free legal representation and advocacy, we do provide that. We have a lawyer on staff, our executive director, Art Crosby, who helps provide that representation and advocacy when it's needed. We do training and outreach in the community. So if your organization needs more fair housing training, then you can always have us come and do a training for you all. We're very happy to do that and make sure that everyone is equipped to be able to advocate for themselves and for their clients to make sure that their rights aren't being denied. And if they are, that they can call us. And mostly we do, not mostly, but we also do discrimination testing. So discrimination testing is this unique feature in which when we're investigating that claim of housing discrimination, and there's not, it's a he said, she said, right? It's hard to gather evidence in that case. We do essentially what is discrimination secret shopping, in which if we believe there is discrimination on the basis of race, we would send in 2 applicants. And we would have one person be white, one person be black, and they would have the same application criteria, and we would see if they were treated differently, right? So that we could take that, we think it's somebody's being discriminated against on the basis of race, and we would be able to go do that kind of testing in order to get the evidence that we would need for court in order to prosecute it. So that's also a part of what we do. It both can be associated with a case. It can also be at random. So if you have anybody you think needs to be tested and you want to let us know, you can. And we also need volunteers for that, especially men. So if you want to be a discrimination tester or know anybody who would like to be a discrimination tester, please reach out, because we can only do that if we have enough people of enough different demographics in order to be able to test for everything. And we are currently short men. So if you know any men that want to be testers, let us know, and they get a stipend. So it is a volunteer, but they do get a stipend when they complete a case with us. So a shout out for that. So biggest, I always want to make sure that you know what's going to happen when you call us, or if you have someone call us. So we have a client-centered approach that we are going to use to determine the best course of action based on both the situation and what the wants of the client. So one, we're going to determine if it actually is a fair housing violation. Some things are just unfair, but not legally a fair housing violation. Or some things are best suited maybe for legal aid if it's just a violation of the Landlord-Tenant Act. So we're going to determine one, if we're the best resource for them or if we need to refer them out. So one, always call us even if you're not sure, because we, our intake can determine that and then figure out where to go. And then based on what the wants of the client are, we know that calling about discrimination can be scary. They can feel like they're going to risk their housing, even though retaliation is illegal, but they might feel like it's at risk. And so we're going to go based on what the wants and the needs of that client are. Most of what we do is mediation, in which we work as a mediator on behalf of the client with their landlord to address the discrimination. So that's most of the cases we have. This, can take anywhere for some couple weeks to several months, depending on like evidence provided, evidence needed, things like that. There also are civil suits that can happen, in which a full lawsuit is filed. This could take much longer of time period, but of course your client wouldn't be working on it for a long period of time. That would be us in the courts, right? They would just give us the initial evidence. So 2 different things that happen. Almost always it's mediation that we're doing here. Okay, so all that on who we are and what we do. Now we're going to go a little bit into what actually is fair housing. I don't know if y'all have gotten a fair housing training before, so we're going to operate on the basis that everybody is new to this concept, unless you guys tell me differently, just so that we can all kind of be on the same footing. So the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. It was created as a part of the Civil Rights Act, right? And it was to prohibit any sort of discrimination in the process, the process of getting a home, whether that be in the sale or rental or a home. And originally it only had 4 protected classes. So all this discrimination is on the basis of a protected class. And those were race, skin color, religion, and national origin. Throughout the years, we have had additional protected classes be added in. In the 70s, sex was added as a protected class. In the 90s, we have familial status and disability. In 2020, gender identity and sexual orientation were added in. They're actually added in under the basis of sex. Though all folks here in Louisville, we work in Louisville. Louisville has had gender identity and sexual orientation be locally added as protected classes since 1999. So it's been around for Louisville folks for a long time, but federally just recently became protected. So, but where it is actually, it's just the right to choose your housing free from any unlawful discrimination, right? It is just the ability to navigate your housing situation without facing any discrimination on the basis of your identity. It protects it in any part of the housing transaction. So it doesn't matter if you're just touring the unit, if you're just calling about a unit, if you're actually applying in the unit, leaving, right? And same for a home sale, whether you're looking at the home in the sale, lending, insurance, whatever part of that home transaction process. All of that is going to be covered under fair housing law. It includes differential treatment in terms and conditions, as well as prohibits retaliation or coercive actions, right? So it means that under no circumstances do we want folks to have any different terms and conditions in any part, whether it be in the application, fees, no matter what. But also, should you use your fair housing rights, we don't want to see retaliated against, and we don't want to see folks being discouraged from using their fair housing rights through any sort of coercive actions. So these are all those protected classes that we listed. Race and skin color, national origin, religion, sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity under that, familial status, and disability. There are some additional protected classes in Louisville. That includes source of income with a big O asterisk, criminal background, homelessness, and veteran status. I will review those very, very quickly, even though I know that's not what we're talking about today, just because I think those ones, I can't leave you without telling you at least a little bit about them, just so that we all have an updated sense for Louisville protected classes. But if there's any of these that you want additional information on, please let me know, because it really can be really helpful, especially as we do our work. Like if you want to talk about language access under national origin, talking about equal access and what rules should be to make sure that LGBTQ folks feel welcome and good in shelters. When it comes to occupancy limits and familial status and what that looks like. So any of these different areas, one, if we have time during the questions at the end, feel free to ask those as questions at the end. Or if it's just something we need a further discussion about, please let me know. If it's something that's coming up for you and your clients, I'm happy to have those kind of further discussions for all the protected classes. And then in general, we're talking about disability today. It is the #1 reported case when it comes to HUD-based complaints that we have. Disability makes up overwhelmingly the largest percentage of our cases. So making sure that we all understand it and can move forward best we can with disability cases and know how to navigate them is always going to be best. So types of properties covered under fair housing. It's not just single family homes and condos and apartments, but it's everybody, right? Everybody's complying under fair housing, homeless and domestic violence shelters, university dorms, student housing, rooms for rent, nursing homes, as well as like your local housing authority, any different housing providers need to follow fair housing law. So everybody's included under that umbrella, not just when somebody's in an apartment or a home or a single family home. And the big examples of different kinds of housing discrimination that we see in our communities is one, subjecting a person to different terms or conditions, right? So we don't want to see, because someone recently left a shelter, the landlord wants them to pay a higher security deposit because they think that means they're going to be an extra risk or a higher risk, right? That means that they're treating someone on the basis of the fact that they're homeless, which we know is a protected class in Louisville, different in their terms and conditions and treatment within their housing, right, with a higher fee. Denying housing is available when it actually is. So this might look like calling it about an apartment and it is available, and then when someone shows up and they have limited English proficiency, suddenly that apartment's no longer available. It's already been rented out, right? When it actually is still available for the community. They just don't want to rent to someone with limited English proficiency. So that kind of discrimination. Retaliation for exercising fair housing rights. So maybe they report their landlord because their landlord didn't allow them a reasonable accommodation. And suddenly now all their maintenance requests never get fulfilled. They used to get fulfilled quickly and now they don't at all. So any sort of retaliation or mistreatment after using their fair housing rights. Steering tenants to select properties. So if someone were to show up as a renter and suddenly they're being steered to a different community on the basis if they were to say look for an apartment in a predominantly white neighborhood, and suddenly that unit's no longer available and they're telling them about a unit in a historically Black neighborhood, right? So any sort of steering to select properties or different areas. We also see this with families. If it's, that they're showing families only units in areas where they think the children will have less of effect on noise, right? So only showing them units that are a little bit farther away, or only showing them units near a playground, or whatever it may be when it comes to families. Advertising that discourage or denies opportunity to people. This can range in a lot of different ways. It might be something just like somebody listing Christian values only, or I will say, if you see anything on like affordable housing, Zillow, even Facebook and Craigslist, all of those count as well when you're trying to navigate for housing for people. Especially I would say on Facebook and like Craigslist, that's advertising. They're putting up their units, right, for people to come look at them. That's them advertising it. People sometimes will write the wildest things in those listings. All you have to do is screenshot that and email it to me, and you're done. If you see anything in a listing that is a violation of fair housing, we've seen things as blatant as like no small children, right, which would be discrimination on the basis of family, any sort of language that is denying people, like saying that they won't accept like Social Security or SSDI, or any sort of commentary in a listing about who they will and will not accept. If it is a violation of fair housing law, please, all you gotta do is screenshot and send that to me and we'll get that taken care of. Because especially on some of the other websites, I think folks think they can write whatever they want. So that sort of advertisement, we don't want to see be put up, and we can get that taken down pretty quickly. Harassment based on a protected class. So harassment cases have gone up, especially on the basis of race. So harassment isn't just referring to sexual harassment, it refers to harassment on the basis of any identity for any of the protected classes. We've seen an increase in this, and so should you see any harassment go on, or if you would like more information on what harassment looks like in housing, once again, we can talk about that if we have time later today, or you feel free to follow up with me after this. But that's something that there was a huge increase in cases in the past year nationally on the basis of harassment. So we want to make sure that we're being really aware of that and vigilant for it for folks as they're navigating their housing process. But any sort of commentary where folks are being made to feel unsafe on the basis, and that commentary is on the basis of their identity. We want to make sure we're being really proactive about and looking for housing providers that have anti-harassment clauses in their leases when we're navigating housing for folks. But yeah, so those are all the big examples. Now, what does discrimination actually look like? So one, it can be a stated preference for tenants based on their actual or perceived like identity. So their race, color, religion, any other identity. So this is just outwardly being treated differently. It's any of these examples, right? All of these are someone being treated solely based on their identity. It is that because a stated preference or different in their terms and conditions, right? That's not the only kind of discrimination that's illegal. There's also a discrimination that is more institutional level, or I think it's easiest to think of one as very overt, one as more covert. And covert discrimination is when a policy or a practice that a housing provider has in place has the impact of discrimination. Now, and it doesn't matter if the intent of that policy was discrimination, if the impact of that policy is discriminatory, then it counts as discrimination. In this, we always say equal access does not mean equal outcomes. So some examples of this might is criminal background checks, right? Criminal background checks are something that we always say are this kind of discrimination. And when I talk about this, I will say disparate impact. So when we're talking about covert discrimination, we're talking about this concept in discrimination law called disparate impact. So if these policies and practices in place have a disparate impact on a protected class, then they are a violation of fair housing law. I do have a video, but I can see if it's going to let me share. I know the sound. Let me share sound. Okay.
Have you ever applied for housing and felt that the process was unfair? Or been turned down for a home loan and suspected that there was something wrong with the qualification criteria? Disparate impact, also known as discriminatory effects, is a form of discrimination where a housing policy or practice looks neutral but significantly harms equal access to fair housing. Discrimination is often subtle, and many people affected by disparate impact might not realize that discrimination is happening. Do any of these situations look familiar? A real estate agent requires a co-signer before showing listings to anyone who does not have a full-time job. That policy may disparately
I'm not
affect
getting the
people who have
video.
disabilities and cannot work full.
Oh, you guys aren't getting the video?
Mm.
I have it.
Huh. Let me see.
Raise your
Okay.
hand if you're seeing the video. Okay, maybe it's just me.
Okay. So after the video's over, I'll give a good little overview. So if
Okay.
anybody else was having an issue, we can do that. Okay. All right.
Have you ever applied for housing and felt that the process was unfair? Or been turned down for a home loan and suspected that there was something wrong with the qualification criteria? Disparate impact, also known as discriminatory effects, is a form of discrimination where a housing policy or practice looks neutral but significantly harms equal access to fair housing. Discrimination is often subtle, and many people affected by disparate impact might not realize that discrimination is happening. Do any of these situations look familiar? A real estate agent requires a co-signer before showing listings to anyone who does not have a full-time job. That policy may disparately affect people who have disabilities and cannot work full-time. A person tries to rent an apartment and is turned away because they have an arrest on their record, even though they were not convicted. This policy often disproportionately affects people of color who experience increased rates of arrest. A real estate office always schedules its closings on Fridays because that is when their staff is most often available. When a Muslim couple is ready to close, they ask to meet any other day of the week because of their Friday prayer schedule, but the office says they are unable to accommodate that request. In all of these examples, the bottom line is this: subtle discrimination is still discrimination. If you think a housing policy
Okay, so I do love that video because I think it gives really good overview of different kinds of examples of what disparate impact could look like. It gives a really common one of criminal background checks. This is one that most folks are familiar with, and that most folks like there's HUD rules, right? There's blanket HUD guidance when it comes to criminal background checks because we know that criminal background check policies can have a disparate impact. So there's already kind of standardized rules for it federally. But it also gives examples that include a little bit more of like cases that are a little less common that we don't see as often within our community that we might not think about, like Friday prayer schedule, right? There's a lot of reasons why you might schedule things on Fridays as an institution, right? You might think this is the best day for our staff with no thought or intent to have a policy that's discriminatory for the community. And yet it can have a discriminatory effect. And that housing provider would not have gotten into any trouble if they hadn't had that sort of policy in place or if they had made that change. So all of that when we look at our policies go into place. So I know this was a large part of an overview that was what fair housing actually is. So now that we all have a good idea of what discrimination can look like and what it is in our community, we're going to talk about disability and how we can navigate kind of service animals. So let's talk about disability and service animal trainings. So for disability, there's a lot of laws that govern disability. Because we're talking about service animals today, we are basically just going to be talking about the ADA and fair housing. But should you ever need anything else when it comes to fair housing and disability, there's a lot of rules that govern it when we're talking about housing and getting into it. When we're talking about disability, it's both physical and mental health disabilities, which we all, of course, know here today because we're talking about emotional support animals and service animals. And so we do like to keep this list on here. We do always like to say that substance abuse disorder is also included within there when we're talking about when we're talking about disability as well. So a wide spectrum of needs for folks, and we don't want to see folks being treated differently on the basis of their disability. So this includes one is that we don't want folks to ask questions by a housing provider. So they should never be asking whether a person has a disability or the nature of said disability. Now, there are going to be some exceptions when it talks about when someone has an emotional support animal and if they need documentation, but there's a very specific way in which they can ask for that. But that never should include asking about the nature or severity of said disability. It can only just be asking for some sort of documentation and clarification on how that emotional support animal is serving said disability. And of course, they might ask only and if only it is needed for said housing. So if they're in housing that is specific for disability use. And then always I like to put in here is that we do have a shortage of available units that are accessible for folks because we know that 16% of our renters have at least one person with a disability, but only 1% have of apartments are accessible to folks. So how actually do we ask for accommodation? So this is when you go and you're asking for the ability to have a service animal or an assistance animal, like an emotional support animal within the home, you are asking for a reasonable accommodation. A reasonable accommodation is a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, policy, or practice that may be necessary to a person with a disability to achieve full enjoyment of their dwelling. So this just means that we have to change some sort of policy in place for that person to be able to enjoy their home. It includes their home and common use and public use spaces. And when you ask for this accommodation, the housing provider could require someone, the housing provider is not allowed to require you to pay any sort of extra fees or deposits as a condition of receiving the accommodation. So in the case of animals, that means they should not be paying any sort of pet rent or any extra pet fees or deposits. And the landlords are required to allow this accommodation as long as it is reasonable. Now, what does the word reasonable mean? Reasonable is a word that means no undue financial or administrative burden upon the housing provider. So as long as it meets the terms of reasonable and it is an accommodation that has to deal with someone's disability and they have and they can have an accommodation letter for it, then we expect that housing provider to grant it. How these get made. So how do you actually make this accommodation request? Should you have somebody that need it? It must be made by the tenant or on behalf of the tenant. It can be made at any time and in no particular manner, right? People might realize that they have a need for any accommodation when it comes to their disability at any point, and also somebody can become disabled at any point, right? The accommodation must be related to the tenant's disability. So for the cases of emotional support animals, that might mean that it has anything to do, it has to have a job in relation to that disability. We always say when we're looking at those, what is that animal has something to do with said disability as diagnosed by their doctor. It has to be related to said thing. So, it can't be that it's your emotional support animal. Your dog needs an emotional support animal. Or your emotional support animal is an emotional support animal. It has to be related to that tenant's said disability. Proper documentation may be requested to support the need for the accommodation, right? So they might ask for a letter in support of that accommodation. Must be reasonable. And the housing provider must participate in an interactive process to address an accommodation request. So an interactive process. When someone goes and has a request for any sort of accommodation, an outright no without any sort of further communication or conversation with the tenant to get to a place that is reasonable is going to be what gets a lot of folks in trouble. We always want to see some sort of conversation happen, some sort of process within the tenant and the housing provider to get to a place where someone can have that equal enjoyment of their dwelling and also be reasonable. So, when we talk about emotional support animals, what are they? And what is the difference between an emotional, okay, I see you got a lot of questions in there, and I promise I'm getting to those.
You
I
just
think
want to
I'm gonna
hold
get to-
off until the end, or do you want to start taking some of them?
For a good amount of these, for Michael that I'm seeing, I'm about to cover, but I'm gonna revisit in just a minute your questions to make sure that I cover each one of these.
Okay, okay.
But if you have questions in general as I'm going, folks, feel free to put them in the chat. If I know I'm gonna talk about them in a second, I will, I'm gonna probably just wait on it, but also feel happy to clarify or go over anything. So for what differentiates a pet, an emotional support animal, also sometimes referred to as an assistance animal, and a service animal. So one is pets are for companionship, right? It can be, any kind of animal, any kind, that's allowed for a pet, and they pay pet fees and deposits. If you're a housing provider, you can require vaccines. You might not require training. You're gonna have to clean up after your pet. You can charge for damages caused by that animal. You can absolutely have rules that say no pets. and you can have restrictions around breeds and weight limits if it is a pet, right? All of those go into play when it's a pet. If it is an animal that is for companionship, it's under the pet category, right? A service animal. So when we're talking about service animals, it is almost always dogs. It can also be mini horses, but we're talking about dogs really that are trained for a specific service. They are for a disability related need. This is where you think of your guide dogs, dogs that specifically can alert for when there's about to be a major medical event for somebody, things like that. Dogs or sometimes mini horses that are specifically trained for a very specific disability related need. Under these, they cannot charge any fee or deposit. You can still require vaccines. There is specific training for it to be a service animal. They still have to clean up after that animal, and you can still charge for any damage caused by that animal. And a service animal is going to differentiate between our emotional support animals in that it also is going to apply to public accommodation as well, right? So places of not just housing, but public accommodation. So that's a service animal, very specific kind of need. They're going to be specifically trained for that specific need, and it's almost always just going to be a dog. Emotional support animal. Emotional support animal can be any kind of animal, right? There's a variety of different types that can come into play here. It can be a dog. I think the most common is actually usually cats. When it comes to emotional support animals, they are still related to a disability. So it might be that someone has an emotional support animal. Maybe they have a cat for anxiety, right? It's still specific to a disability related need that they have in their home. And because of that, you cannot charge any sort of fee or deposits. You can still require vaccines. Training might not be required for this, like to differentiate between that service animal. You still have to clean up after that animal. You can still have to pay for damages that are caused by that animal. We also don't want to see any breed restrictions or weight limitation rules come into play for emotional support animals, right? So if somebody has a rule around pit bulls, but somebody has an emotional support animal that's a pit bull, they should be allowed to have get an accommodation request to have that emotional support animal. So those are the differentiations between those different kinds of animals when it leads to it. So one of the questions that was asked though is, can we have more than one emotional support animal in a home? Absolutely. There's a lot of reasons why you might have more than one emotional support animal in a home. One, it's that more than one person might live in that home, and more than one person in that home might have a disability, right? Also, we know that folks can have more than one disability. Somebody might have a service animal and emotional support animal, right? Somebody can be blind and have anxiety, and maybe they have their dog for their seeing eye dog, and they have an emotional support cat for that anxiety, or they could have depression and anxiety, right? So people could have more than one need for any given animal within the home. Now, our rule of thumb that we use is that every animal needs to have a specific job, right? So it can't be, I have depression, I need a dog for my depression, I have 4 dogs for said depression, right? That's not going to be reasonable. But I have depression and I have anxiety, and I have one dog that helps me with my depression. It's a very active dog, gets me out of the bed every day, gets me moving. It helps. And in that way, it helps with my depression. And I have another dog that's super cuddly that sits on my chest when I have a panic attack from my anxiety, right? Okay. Each dog, right, is having a different job. Whereas in the other case, it's only one disability and maybe all of those, and just a bunch of dogs that all do the same thing. They're all not having kind of their individual job when related to that disability. That's kind of our rule of thumb when we're looking at kind of what's reasonable and what is actually a need for that emotional support animal when we're looking at it. But the biggest thing is that somebody needs to have a letter for if they're going to ask for it. So like we talked about earlier, is that landlords can ask for proper documentation. What proper documentation is that it is from their primary care provider for their disability. Now, that could be different depending on the person, right? Every disability is different, and who is the primary care provider for that disability might be different. Also, people have, limited access to healthcare services. So it could be a peer support group, it could be a therapist, it could be their primary care doctor, it could be, a variety of, it could even be their license, if you have a licensed caseworker who specifically handles your disability, right? It can come from a variety of places that provide that documentation, but it needs to be their primary care for their disability, is the person providing that accommodation letter. And if somebody with a license is writing a letter and willing to put their medical license or their social work license or whatever license it may be on the line to say this person needs it for this related disability, that's where we tell our housing providers that that's kind of where they need to cut off kind of the investigation for that. However, we do know that there are scam websites out there in which folks are being told to pay money in order to get a emotional support letter or a certificate or a registration or licensing for those animals. That is not going to be proper documentation. And if we get that case, we're going to tell those folks, no, you cannot have this emotional support animal. This is not proper documentation. So really tell folks to avoid websites that are selling these kind of certificates and there's not going to be certificates. You don't get a certificate for emotional support animal. There's no registration list. There's no licensing. It is a letter from your doctor that says this person needs this animal for their disability. That's what the documentation it is. It is not some paid for on a website weird kind of thing. We don't want to see folks falling victim to those scam sites when it comes to that, and buying gear that says emotional support animal, right? Like those sort of things aren't needed. The thing that is needed is the letter from your primary care provider. Nothing else when it comes to that. And so I know that was, so that was to the question. So Kentucky doesn't certify emotional support animals. There's no list. And housing providers can absolutely not accept documentation if it is from a scam site. But if it is from a licensed professional, you need to accept it. I had this come up earlier where somebody was like, all of our asked for accommodation when it comes to letters are coming from this one doctor who doesn't serve in this state. Well, one, somebody might be receiving telehealth, and they might be certified in the state, they just don't live here. And if that person is willing to put their entire medical license, right? If they're willing to put their whole medical license on the line for someone to be able to, because they want to let folks pay to put in a emotional support letter and they want to do accommodation letters and they shouldn't be doing it, then that's them doing the wrongdoing. You still need to accept the letter. It's if it is from a verified doctor, then you need to accept it. Is kind of where it is. If you are not sure if it looks scammy and you want us to be involved in that process, if you're like, you don't want to get in trouble with fair housing, it looks like a scam, but you're not sure, you can call us and use us as a community resource in order for us to be able to kind of better assess that sort of situation. So that's where we can kind of come in and be that resource for folks as we navigate the situation with emotional support animals when it comes in to that kind of process. And when it comes to this emotional support animals, one thing I want to come up back to here is that we're not talking about a free for all for everybody, right? You can still charge for damages. You can still, even if you don't have a breed restriction, but if that animal ends up being aggressive towards another person, you can still move forward with like having a lease violation for that animal being aggressive. You can still, I would say noise complaints are going to be super fair housing sensitive. That's where you might get into a little bit tricky, and we can talk about that more if folks have questions specifically around noise complaints. Because those can be a little bit tricky when it comes to fair housing, but you know, you want to make sure you navigate those well, but it does, you know, it doesn't mean that we want to see that there's no rules for emotional support animals. They still have all of these rules that they're going to be required to follow, right? As well as service animals. The rules come into play is that we don't want to see them really charged any extra fees or deposits, and we want to make sure that they're allowed said animal, even if there is a no pet rule, and we want to see, you know, breed restrictions and weight limitations be disregarded. Those are the sort of things that come into play with emotional support animals. Okay. So with that, I do have it here. So for modifications can come into play, especially if someone should need it for their animal for any reason. And this is where a structural change might be needed to be made to an existing premise for that to be occupied with the person with a disability. So that can include any exterior or interior of a dwelling or a common space or an area. In this case, the tenant is responsible for any cost, as if you are not somebody who provides, who gets federal assistance. So we do want to see modifications get allowed as well. I will say when it comes to animals, this is less common, but it can still come into play. Like if someone were to need a fence for a dog, or that is their, like if they have a service animal and they need a fence or something like that, it could still come into play there. So worth noting, and because there is that difference in that the tenant does have to be pay for any sort of modification. Like your accommodation rules, the modification rules is a person has to live in the unit, and a landlord may require the tenant to restore the unit to a pre-modification, and they can require a deposit. And those requests can be made at any time and in no particular manner. And there can be a request made for an explanation between the relationship of the disability and the modification. And we do want to see folks get permission before making said modification. So like I said, when it comes to animals, that can look like any sort of, like if they were to need a change in order to have that animal in their home, they were to need to make a modification. So making that request because they have a service animal within their home might be how a modification shows up. But they that I would say is a little less common. Most common is folks needing like a ramp or grab bars or something like that is how modifications usually show up. I do want to go ahead and pause here and make sure that I give folks some time. I'm going to go back to this slide because I know this is where we and give folks, if they have any questions regarding everything we just talked about regarding emotional support animals and supporting and service animals. No questions? I find that a little hard to believe, guys. Any hands up? Okay, I see we have 2 folks with hands up. Or if they can unmute, I think Carrie and Belle both have hands up.
All right, let me find the right button here. Okay, Carrie.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have a question. I had my hand up earlier about the video.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thank you,
Sorry.
Carrie.
All right, Belle, let's see. Belle, did you have a question? You should be unmuted now. Unmute yourself. There we
I-
go.
I did, but I had already typed it out in the chat.
Okay, okay.
Okay, so
Right.
this is, Belle asked, what about when a deposit is doubled and they say it's due to credit score? So if we're talking about like emotional support animals, like, if it's like for a pet fee or deposit, right, and you're doing accommodation, you don't pay for anything. If we're talking about just in general, when somebody's applying and, it's a different term and condition, then like recent, if it's a different term and condition for just applying because of their credit score, that's tricky. Credit scores are super fair housing sensitive in that we know that they can have a disparate impact upon folks, for who are different protected classes, especially for people of color. We know that there's a disparate impact when it comes to credit score rules, and especially for folks with vouchers, when it comes to rules like that. So that's one where I would actually say it's going to depend on the situation, and we would want you to probably follow up with us and talk to us about what you're seeing there. So I'm going to keep that one in my back pocket for the end, Bell, just in case we have some extra time to follow up with you about. Yeah. And
So Mike had a question about barking.
barking. So for noise complaints regarding emotional support and service animals, one is, we need to make sure kind of if it's happening during normal hours, right? During standard, like no, not during quiet, not when folks are trying to sleep, right? Making that differentiation. What is actually in this animal being bothersome and not. And if everyone's getting in trouble for noise complaints, not just the folks who have a disability, right? No, not just folks who need an emotional support animal or service animal. If we're making sure that our rules are being super sensitive and implementing them around that emotional support animal. So I would say that's one where you want to make sure that you're kind of following that kind of through in a way that's super sensitive to those rules and making sure that no one's getting singled out or being treated differently because of said disability and the fact that they need an emotional support animal. If it's during regular hours of the day, where everyone else is making noise and living in their units, right? If we're all living in an apartment building, it's loud. We know it's going to be loud because other people live around us. But if it is, creating that disturbance for folks in their home, especially at night and where you might have some quiet hours and rules, then having a conversation with that person who has the emotional support animal, talking through it with them, and letting them know, like, yes, we do allow for the emotional support animal. You asked for an accommodation request, therefore we waive our pet fee. We allow you a pet, even we have a no pet rule. However, it does mean you still do need to follow the rules that are dictated in your lease. If those rules are around whatever the noise rules are, you and that animals still need to be obligatory under these as well, and then follow through said there. So it is a little bit more of a trickier situation to navigate, but making sure you have that really good communication with the tenant to follow kind of through on that.
Kat, can I jump in here for a
Mhm.
second and just talk about some personal experiences I had when I was doing direct services and I was also managing properties. The barking issue came up a lot.
Mhm.
And people not picking up after their pets. We've got leash laws in Louisville that people didn't go by the leash laws, and that's not something that we thought of. That's something that Jefferson County has in place, that when your animal is outside, it needs to be on a leash and things like that. But one of the things I think we have to remember is that our goal is to keep people housed.
Mhm.
And we don't want people to lose their housing over something that we might be able to help them fix. So if you've got an animal that has some behavioral issues, maybe we can help that client or that tenant access the Humane Society or PetSmart or someplace that does obedience training to help that client, because that's going to help that client and that animal be successful in that unit, as opposed to, oh, you've got a lease violation,
Mhm.
you know, we're going to kick you out.
Yeah.
And I
And
think,
that's where you might get some fair housing trouble, is that immediate jump.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, we want to help our clients be successful. We
Mhm.
don't want them to be homeless again over something that maybe if a case manager or a peer specialist could provide some additional support there, then maybe, you know, that the animal could have an intervention and
Mhm.
learn to be less aggressive or resource guarding or whatever. And, you know, and I'm speaking as a crazy dog lady myself. Uh, we want we want our clients and our tenants to be responsible, but we want them to be successful also.
Yeah. Yeah. So making sure you have clear communication, and working with the tenant, and working with that folks with their emotional support animal as they go through it. Okay. And I saw some questions about whether you can have these. I will absolutely give these. I'll provide these slides to Laura, so she has your emails to be able to provide them out. And then my email will be at the end if there's any educational material that you noted. We do have one that is about just ESAs and emotional support animals. We have a brochure and stuff, if that is going to be helpful. Yeah, Noelle, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I'm going through the questions. There was one posted by Michael down here, with multiple questions. I was wondering if they've been addressed.
Yes, so I think we've gone through all of those because one asked about certifying in Kentucky. There, you do not, there's no Kentucky certifications. And we went over internet certifications that we need to do, barking. Let me make sure I got pet and state. Yeah, so I think we got most of those. I think we have also some folks about, let's see, guinea pigs. So a guinea pig can be emotional support animal. That's absolutely okay. Once again, they're gonna have to show that it's related to their disability. But as long as they have that accommodation letter and say that it's their guinea pig is their emotional support animal, then and yeah, such as
And there was a question about group living situations like sober living homes, transitional living, refusing to accept emotional support animals.
so yeah, you can still refer those cases to us. Well, we're going to get into it. It might be that, you know, what is reasonable for, you know, sober and transitional living room. So they might be able to show that it does cause some sort of undue like financial or administrative burden, but that's something that they're going to have to show. You can absolutely still make the request. And then if they're refusing to have any sort of conversation about it, that's where you can go ahead and contact us, where we can talk with those folks. But sometimes you do have situations with sober living homes or transitional living homes where they do have that's kind of specified. No, we can prove that this kind of causes this kind of burden, but we still want to see folks be able to make that request and make sure that they are having that kind of interactive process with them. So shelters might have those kind of reasons already kind of in play. I know for most shelters they kind of do. They show that kind of undue financial burden when it comes, or undue administrative, because there is, you know, legitimate reasons why they don't allow for ESAs. I don't know, if you've had any commentary or situations with those kind of cases.
We actually have a case like that. I believe Art is working on it. Multiple tenants do have ESAs, and because they were in one home, the landlord, and I don't know if it's called a landlord or what, they were trying to say that only one ESA was allowed. However, it is several different ESAs for, well, it's one ESA for several different individuals, so they each have their own, and it covers their own disability. It's not for everyone else. So they do have to allow that.
Yeah. So, if unsure, you can always refer the case to us to kind of see what it is. But I will say usually for shelters, yes, and the letter has to come, yes, from a certified. So here we go. Let me see. how current does an ESA letter need to be? So it needs to be from like their current provider. I don't know if there's a specific date that we usually have for an expiration on it or a certain rule. I would say that like we would look for it to be with their current diagnosis. Noah, do you have a specific date?
So we do get this a lot here, and I have covered this with Art. So there really isn't really an expiration date on the ESA letter as long as they still have that disability. And
Mm-hmm.
the way we see it is a disability is not just going to disappear.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not really a time frame for the ESA letters.
So it should be good. Yeah, as long as they still have that diagnosis and it's related to their diagnosis, I would say that it's okay. You know, we would hope that they would still be seeing that service provider or have some ability to contact that service provider, but that shouldn't be as a requirement as well. Like folks lose their health insurance all the time, so there might be no longer able to see them.
And you also they might end up with a different provider because there's quit or something. I do want to say,
Mhm.
because that did kind of bring up some question, is you can't ask them if they
Mhm.
still have that disability. So don't do that.
Yeah, don't ask any questions. Like when we're getting documentation and we're talking about documentation, yes, it should not come from an internet source, right? It's not from any of these kind of people who are trying to sell or do a scam website, right? It's not any of this. It's from their primary care, but it doesn't mean that because you're asking for documentation, you're asking about disability. We're not asking about this person's disability. We're not asking for what reason they need it. We're not asking for how it is viable. You're asking for documentation from their primary care provider that shows that they need this emotional support animal in relation to said disability.
Hey,
Um,
Kat,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be a doctor,
Yeah,
right?
and it doesn't have to be their doctor. It's their primary care
Okay, and
related.
when you give me copies of the slides, could you give me a sample template that a provider could use?
I'll see if we have a sample I'm pretty sure we do have one. I also have a resource that where HUD has like a questions to ask yourself or your tenant when they ask you about an emotional support animal. It kind
Okay,
of goes
good.
through a yes, no
Right.
of what you can do that HUD has to kind of go through that process. They also have like guidance on like what on this, like this is from a HUD sheet, right? This is documentations from websites on assistance animals, where there's scam websites. Because we also don't, just as much as we don't want housing providers having to have to like shift through and determine if something's a scam, we don't want people wasting money on scam websites. Like it's a big headache for everybody. So there's some HUD stuff that we can I can give you that goes through an exact yes no kind of situation on that.
Also, if your complex doesn't have disability verification forms and you're not sure what's required on those, we here at Kentucky Fair Housing have a disability verification form, and we'd be more than happy to send you a template.
Yeah. But in general, for housing providers, we always recommend that you have some sort of policy already in place when it comes to accommodations and modifications. So everyone on your staff knows exactly what to do when somebody says, I need to put in, oh, I need to make an accommodation request. So that there's no misunderstanding. So making sure that folks know what that process is, and what your policy is in place, to kind of move forward in it is, always going to be the best move there for handling requests. And so those kind of best practices look like that all of your requests be made in writing, that you get a document for it. If you should you need documentation, that you get it, and whoever that primary care is, and once again, it's not just a doctor, it can be a therapist, community social worker, credible peer support group, whoever it is that is their primary related to said disability. And that it does have to be related to that tenant's disability, and try to maintain that interactive process to have that conversation with the tenant when there is no sort of interactive process, just an outright no, we don't allow it, or anything like that, that's where you can get into fair housing trouble. Of course, if you do have a designated reason, no, this is unreasonable, no, this documentation is not valuable, right? But it's a no with whatever comes next, right? And if you're unsure, we would much rather you call us and talk to us ahead of schedule rather than us having to send some sort of letter afterwards. We'd rather be a resource than the person getting folks in trouble. So make sure to use us as said resource, and make sure there's no retaliation ever for asking for some sort of accommodation request. Do you want to see as all the questions got answered regarding emotionals, regarding what we went over so far? Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions from you guys. I will say, a couple of things that we put in here, towards the end is that, one, a big thing regarding disability is going to be medical marijuana coming up. If you don't already know how to handle medical marijuana, please, contact us and we'll help you get that into place. It's non-smokable, so it shouldn't have changed anything. But we anticipate this having some issues. So if you haven't heard me talk about this issue yet and you want to hear about it, please let me know. And this is our best practices for housing providers always that we always want to see, is written procedures, written applicant criteria, that they offer up all units to prospective tenants, that fair housing policies are signed by all employees, that all employees are trained, right? Because and trained up not just on fair housing training, but on whatever policies that you have regarding fair housing, whether it be language access or accommodation requests or whatever it may be. That policy is only helpful if all the staff knows how to use it and implement it. So making sure that everybody's trained up, that if you need fair housing education materials like posters or brochures or anything like that, just get them from us and have them displayed and ready. Policies in place for accommodations and policies in place for harassment, to be put into place so that hopefully we just have we come and do trainings for you and we don't ever have to contact our housing providers for any other reason. And then should you need any ways to get involved with us after this, this is kind of the way to do that. Whether it be pass this information along to a neighbor, signing up for our newsletter, becoming a volunteer tester, scheduling a training, or have us table at an event if you need us. And then I do want to leave this up while I answer any last questions that folks have. I do want to make sure that we have that available to folks. I think we got another 15 minutes if folks have any other questions.
Yeah. Did you put your contact information in the chat?
Yes, I'll put that in there. I'm going to type my contact information into the chat for you guys. And if nobody has any other questions about emotional support animals, once again, I'm happy to answer about any of the other protected classes if you guys need it while I'm here.
I have a question, and this is something that I've seen a handful of times. If we go into a situation where there's an emotional support animal and everything was done up front, it was all done the way that it was supposed to be, but we see that that animal is being neglected or abused. What is our responsibility as case managers, peer specialists, landlords?
I would say that one's a bit trickier. I would say having a conversation with that. I mean, because what are you seeing? What is that abuse, right? If it's the animal's being left out, if it's not being taken care of properly or different things like that. I mean, you can note like if you have any rules regarding that, but I think that one might be a little, I don't know. Is Noelle still on here with me? If you've had any of cases regarding when it comes to abuse, because I would say you would still want to report that, whether it be an emotional support animal or not.
While it is an ESA and you yourself can't get rid of it. If they're being neglected or, abused, you may contact like your local animal services or
Yeah,
protective
I would say
services for the
there's no
animal.
fair housing reason why you wouldn't be allowed to report
Okay.
abuse,
Yeah.
like that, yeah. I didn't think we've had any, luckily I haven't had any cases come through like that. But yeah, I wouldn't see any reason why you couldn't report that. Just like, they're gonna have to clean up after themselves and everything like that with the animal.
To touch up on harassment policy real quick, because we have like 4 cases with that right now. So a lot of the times what we've been seeing in our cases is one tenant is being harassed nonstop by another tenant. And instead of evicting the offending tenant, they try to evict both. We would like to discourage that. Don't evict both tenants if it's just one who's harassing the other.
There you go. Yeah, like I said, harassment cases have been going up a lot. I know that's not what we're talking about today. I did want to note it just because I think if you do see it or want to talk about more of it, please let us know, because those are going up, unfortunately. And it can be related to somebody's disability.
I'm interested in the medical marijuana information. I think
Yes.
maybe in 2025, we could do another fair housing training and focus on that topic because we're going to see more and more of this.
Yes, and just as an overview for everyone here, medical marijuana is non-smokable. Medical marijuana is non-smokable, and medical marijuana is non-smokable. If someone is
Is
smoking
it
marijuana,
non-smokable?
it is non-smokable. You do not have to change your smoking rules. You don't have to change your smoking rules. If someone is smoking marijuana, it is not for a disability. It is just because they are smoking marijuana. It is still a lease violation. Yeah, that's essentially the training. But we do that more in depth and give a lot of rules, but that is the training. You can absolutely, and we go over exactly how you can enforce those rules, what it looks like, what the exact rules are around what marijuana they're allowed to have and what we recommend. So I absolutely am happy to have that conversation, but that is my big message, is that it is non-smokable. You're not changing anything. Please don't change anything. Please don't do anything. Please don't report people for using their medical marijuana and kick them out. But also know they can't smoke it. If they're smoking it, it is not from their disability. They're doing it recreationally. Yeah, is there any other questions for folks? I do know we did get that credit question earlier, and if they're still in here, the rules around credit scores is that they shouldn't have a disparate impact, which usually just means we like to see discretion when it comes to how you use credit score screenings, just like with criminal backgrounds. Being able to say this is why you need that criminal background rule, and reframing from kind of having blanket policies in different aspects like that. I will say credit scores are really hard. There's not a lot of case law when it comes to it. So those kind of cases are super tricky in proving a disparate impact upon folks. But if that's a conversation that you need to have or want to have with us, use my email and kind of tell me more about what you're seeing. And I can do a little bit more research on it, but those are tricky.
All right, other questions regarding the animals or fair housing in general? All right, so we've got your contact information.
Mm-hmm. And I'll give you these slides after we're done.
Sure, and I will get those emailed out to everybody. And then any other things that you can think of that we could benefit from, please feel free to include those. And my friend Kim has a comment. It's been really good training. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good
guys.
conversation here today. And I
Yeah.
can tell just from the list of participants, we've got a wide range of experience in here, which is always good. People who are
Fantastic.
fairly new to the field and some who have been doing this for many years. All right, more good comments. You all will get a prompt for an evaluation. Don't forget to fill that out. You can check our website, the coalition's website, in a few days for a recording of this presentation, and you will get the slides and any handouts that Kat has. And the next community table is going to be on November the 6th. early childhood education resources. And we will get that invitation up on our website, and I will also send that invitation out to the masses. So if there's nothing else, then I will go ahead and end things. And thank you to the wonderful folks at Kentucky Fair Housing Council for sharing your time and expertise with us today. We always appreciate when you are with us, and you always have such good and helpful things to say to us.
Well, appreciate you all. Thanks, guys, for coming out and listening to us today. And feel free to use this resource. If you ever need us, just reach out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Everybody have a good day.